Well, good evening. Welcome to my question and answer session for Friday evening, October 23rd, 2020. Just wanted to drop in, say hello, and possibly give you some ideas and thoughts for today. Honestly, nobody sent me any questions for this week, so I really don't have a heck of a lot to answer for. That said, I do have things that I can, in fact, talk about. There are a lot of things actually going on in the world around me. I was thinking originally about talking about the American election, but let's face it, everybody's talking about that right now. There is a really good bunch of articles around now because John Piper has recently put out an article from Desiring God, which I honestly think I agree with, which causes some consternation in some circles. But if you want to check it out, it's at desiringgod.org. It's called Policies, Persons, and Paths to Ruin. It talks about how there are some fairly serious things to be dealt with for all candidates in the presidential election. But I think I'd actually like to talk about something different tonight, if that's okay with you guys. Hi, John Lewis. Greeting to John Troke as well, and hi as well to Deanna. Thank you guys for showing up, for watching me tonight. I think that's everybody that's actually watching me tonight. I just wanted to say again, hello. My name is Steve Daw. I am a pastor at a small church in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. I'm the educational director for Mile One Mission, which is a small church planting organization that works here in St. John's, Newfoundland, to plant good Bible-believing churches, hopefully without some of the massive dysfunction that has kind of plagued Christianity, especially in North American Christianity lately. I'm sure that as we deal with some dysfunction, some other dysfunction will show up. Because Christians, well, we're just sinners. We just happen to be saved. Honestly, one of the weirdest things that I think comes about Christianity, people think that Christians are somehow believe that they're more moral. I remember Jordan Peterson at one point saying that, if you believe in God, you've got to be a more moral person. And that's kind of denying the need for mercy and grace. And mercy and grace are pretty central to the Christian message and to Christian ideas. You see, we as Christians, the main reason that we are Christians is that we recognize we need to be saved, that we are so seriously messed up that we need Jesus Christ in our lives to save us. So it's kind of weird that people would imagine that Christians are somehow more moral than other people. We're just people who recognize that we aren't moral. And so because of that, when we're in the church, we have to recognize that churches also are going to develop idiosyncrasies, and depending on the culture that we're in, churches are going to have, sin in them. I am a pastor at a church, and I'm going to be the first to tell you right now that I am a sinner, and that every morning I wake up fully and totally convinced of God's need to save me. If I don't have Jesus in my life, there is nothing recommending me to God. And to be honest, I just so emulate resonate with the idea that Spurgeon says that, take heart. The person who thinks worst of you, you're far worse than he even imagines. And God saves us even in the midst of that. And that's really, really important. But the problem is going to be that churches, since Christians are made up of, sinning Christians, churches develop different kinds of sinful problems. I think one of the biggest problems that we've run into here in the modern world is that, first of all, the mainline churches were so focused on the centrality of their denominational authorities that they didn't focus enough on the centrality and the unity that we find in Jesus Christ. And so as a result, the maintenance of the overall overarching institutions became more valuable than the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the result was that all sorts of interesting, strange theologies entered into the mainline churches, of which I grew up as part of. And the result was weird theologies that agreed with the world and were honestly reactions to what we saw in other more fundamentalist or more evangelical groups. And evangelicalism in the modern world has been kind of more about felt needs lately. At least for the last 50 to 100 years, it's been more about the felt needs of the individual and getting people to make a decision for Jesus Christ. And as a result, the churches that came about were marked by a kind of holiness that was based on, a big, massive change from being a sinner to, when you're saved, somehow that flipped a switch and you suddenly became more moral. And so a lot of churches were focused on making sure that the local church was all about holiness, with the result that people often tended to hide the fact that they were in fact sinners. Because, as sinners, then we're not showing the holiness that God would require of us. And now, don't get me wrong, holiness is very important. It is important that we are daily putting to death the deeds of the flesh by the Spirit. It's important that, as John Owen would say, that we would be putting to death sin, because otherwise sin will be putting us to death. Unfortunately, the excesses of the churches leads to strange ideas. And I've been reading a book this week by Alyssa, can't remember the last name. It's called Another Gospel, but it's about progressivism. And the difficulty that I see in coming from into an evangelical denomination from a very mainline denomination, I'm kind of struck by the progressive church, and this is against the progressive church. The progressive church is generally people who think that they need to have a new understanding of Jesus, that the understanding that we see throughout history has been overstated, or that the gospel has been kind of messed up. Oh, it's Alyssa Childers. John Lewis got it right. And yeah, hey, Jason, that's, hey, brother, it's good to see you as well. Yeah. Just talking about progressivism, the progressive gospel or the progressive church tends to say things like, well, the church needs to understand the world as it now is. Oftentimes they bring in doctrines like the idea that the Bible is inspired only in the same way that a really good book by C.S. Lewis is also inspired. That's, by the way, not what we mean by inspiration biblically. At least in Orthodox circles, but that's what they would say. They would talk a lot about the need to be more loving and to have, as a few different people have said lately on Facebook, that we need to be more about finding love to define our understanding of the Bible rather than understanding the Bible to understand love. So to define the Bible through our lenses of love, or to err on the side of love. Now, the problem, of course, with that is if us Orthodox people are correct, we're sinners, and our definition of love is going to be pretty messed up. Jason would say that progressives need an unremarkable Jesus to make themselves feel good. I sometimes agree with that, but I think it's more than that. I think it's sometimes they've been usually hurt by evangelical or fundamentalist churches and end up, well, saying and asking questions and coming up with the same answers that the mainline church came up with about 100 years ago, what we would call standard Protestant liberalism. Yeah. I think John Troke says it the best here. I like his statement here. He says, the progressives presume the failures of the church to be doctrine-based rather than people-based. And yeah, he's right. That's about the situation we face. But it's always a little puzzling to me as a convert to an evangelical denomination. I was raised in a church that, generally speaking, would have had more to do with progressivism. Most of my friends in high school and college would have had very liberal leanings. It's the reason that a lot of the more progressivist refugees from evangelical denominations here in Newfoundland have found themselves as part of the church that I grew up in, which is in some cases fitting, but in others kind of sad. Because progressivism, like liberalism, is kind of doomed to failure, just like, honestly, fundamentalism at some levels would be too. You see, where we miss Jesus Christ, where we move away from who Jesus is, the impressive Jesus who is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life, we lose as we move away from him, we move away from a gospel message that actually saves people, and away from a hope to be changed into something better than who we are. Progressivism, as liberalism before it, tends to agree a great deal with the world around us, with the culture that we're part of. And the culture that we're part of is honestly kind of messed up, as it always is, because it's based on people. And we're not born perfect. We're not born completely innocent. We're born as people who need to be saved. We're born as people who need to be improved. I'm not from the get-go perfect. I've had to learn things. I've had to unlearn things. And yet, there is nothing in progressivism to allow me to expand, to be bigger. And it just strikes me as strange that so many people would find this a positive thing, to seek after a very limited Jesus who doesn't give us any hope for anything in the future. Progressivism is going to be kind of a different melange of a whole bunch of different ideas. There's going to be a whole bunch of different things that people are going to say that would all fit into generally progressivism. Progressivism today are going to quote teachers like Richard Rohr, or to a lesser extent, some of the more recent liberal theologians in the Anglican Church, like Marcus Borg or John Shelby Spong. But they're also going to be talking about, well, the acceptance of sin, things that we would know today as sinful, that we would see in Scripture as sinful, and that they would say we today know that weren't as bad as we thought they were. And because they actually identify with the society where they cannot give hope to the society, they're just simply saying the exact same thing that the culture says. And they're using words to try and make it so that this Christian gospel fits in with it. Usually, progressivism is just a way of moving away from the gospel of Jesus Christ while still keeping at least some of the language to be able to say it. And it's kind of a sad thing to be reading Alyssa Childers now and finding out that it's being embraced by a new generation of evangelicals who will find out like their parents found out. Or, well, actually not their parents, their spiritual parents found out. Progressivism is a dead end. Just like liberalism was a dead end before it. Just like, by the way, I'd say that the seeker sensitivity that they're running from, or the fundamentalism that they tend to be that they were burned by, are also dead ends. Just like the weird doctrine of name it and claim it, or prosperity gospel, is a dead end. And I think this is kind of something that I had to talk about a lot when it comes to some of the definition of Protestantism and why Protestantism is about talking about the truth. But if we are talking about the truth, well, everything other than the truth is going to be a lie. And so there's going to be a lot more ways to be wrong than to be right. Progressive Christianity, I think, is a reaction to error, either error in prosperity or error in seeker-sensitive types of doctrine, or error in fundamentalism, and just reacting with another error. namely progressivism. In some ways, it's kind of similar to the situation we see in the 2020 US election. And there are a bunch of different groups, and we're left asking which one is going to be least damaging in the end. Well, luckily, the world around us isn't a two-party system like the American government. We don't have to choose between the lesser of two evils. Nobody has to choose any false doctrine. We can choose the gospel of Jesus Christ. We can choose to chase after God himself as he reveals himself through Scripture. We're probably going to get it wrong from time to time. We're probably going to miss the truth from time to time. But we have the opportunity to seek after it. We don't need to vote for one of the falsehoods. We can actually seek Jesus. And by God's grace, it's what we do as Christians. Anyway, that was me ranting for about 20 minutes. Has anybody come up with a question yet? I have talked about progressivism for a great deal. I've talked about a little bit about the election. I think the big problem with the U.S. election, by the way, isn't so much which party you're going to vote for. It's the kinds of people that we're becoming as we do these kinds of election things. The gospel of Jesus Christ is that we are saved from our sin by the goodness of Jesus Christ. That while we were yet sinners, while we were enemies of God, God loved us enough to save us from our own sin. And yet now, for some reason, depending on which form of Christian you are, you're either going to be blasting the right-wing Republicans for hating the poor and the widow and the outcast, or you're going to be blasting the left for hating the unborn and religious freedom and all sorts of things. You know what? Whatever our vote is, whatever our political position is, we need to be Christians in the midst of it. The path forward, Jason asks me a really good question here. What is the path forward then? I think the path forward in politics is going to be the same path forward that we see in, well, the general church. It's harder than picking one side and voting. But we need to be the kinds of people who, well, remain faithful regardless of the situation. Just a big simple one. We need to be people who love our enemies. It's interesting, progressive Christians and liberal Christians and conservative Christians and fundamentalist Christians will all say that Jesus probably taught his disciples to love their enemies. Nobody disagrees with that point. And yet that's the one that we have the most trouble with, to love our enemies. To say, yes, I actually think that X enemy political party may be evil, but I have to love them. I have to treat them with charity. I have to be willing to listen to what they say. I have to be willing to answer their actual complaints. And as I vote, I need to be voting in such a way as, well, matches what the gospel is teaching me to do, but not judging my neighbor to figure out what he should vote. I need to vote the way God calls me to vote. But the vote is going to be the least part of our political action now. You see, believers, if we're going to be true believers in the modern world, we're going to need to be faithful in the midst of difficult situations. We're going to need to live for Jesus, even if it's going to make us enemies on both sides of the aisle, because neither side of the aisle is really for Jesus all the way. So we need to be for Jesus all the way, whatever that leads to. Again, it doesn't give me a good, simple answer of how to vote. I'm busy thinking about how I'm going to vote for the next election in Canada. We have a minority government right now, which could fall literally at any moment. So we could be in an election in next week or in 4 years. We don't know. So I need to be thinking about how I'm going to vote for that and how I'm going to act within the midst of that. And before that, I'm going to have to be the kind of person who advocates for truth in the midst of the situations, regardless if that's right-wing truth or left-wing truth. There are things that the left wing says that are correct. There are things that the right wing says that are correct. We need to be about truth. As Jason again puts it, Jason, you're being too wise for us today. We need to be sold out for Christ and for the kingdom. We need to be believers. So yeah, that's that. I think that's going to be the situation we face. If we're going to be believers, if we're going to be salt and light in the world that we have, if we're going to be, as the Facebook meme goes, salt and light instead of salty and lit, we're going to need to seek after Jesus in everything we do and say, we're going to need to be more holy than Pharisees. We're going to have to be the kinds of people who cling ruthlessly to Jesus Christ, not to my own righteousness, but to his, not to my own knowledge, but to his, and not to my ability to save the world, but his. We need to be sold out for Christ and the kingdom instead of for the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party or the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or whatever, the Labour Party or the, what do the British have anyway? Yeah. And I think John has a really good point here. He gives us a bit of a long point. I can't throw it up all on the screen because it's too long. John says loving enemies is very difficult, which is always why it is a good thing to consider how sinful we are and how God actually loved us. Jesus is always a good example of how we ought to be. Now, Jesus isn't sinful. He wasn't an enemy of God, but while we were enemies, he put aside godhood. He counted as not something to be grasped and came down to die a death of a sinner for our sake. Are we willing to love our enemies at that level? Are we willing to put ourselves in the kinds of situations that will lead us to be, well, to face the opposition that may come, whatever that looks like? We live in a nation and a world of, well, sinners, just as all the churches are full of sinners. Can we point them all to Jesus instead of pointing them to saints? And can we be saints, people saved by Jesus alone, not people who are righteous in themselves? In any case, yeah. I did have another question, by the way. John Lewis asks me, would I consider a book review for one of my podcasts? I totally would. The difficulty is going to be I don't know which book to do, and my reading is really, really out of whack these days. I read a book and then finish it, and then I see another one that's I finish part of it, and then I see another book that's, ooh, that's really cool, and I go and read part of it. I'm hoping to finish the Alyssa Childers book. It looks very good. I mean, I finished a few really good ones lately, so I probably could do a book review. So that's probably a good thing. Honestly, nothing I say is my own ideas. I'm not very good at coming up with my own ideas. I just simply read other people's. They're very good. And I'm hoping that most of my ideas come from the Bible because that's a very good book. Yeah. Anyway, brothers and sisters, I just want to thank you for coming tonight, for hanging out with me, for letting me rant a little bit about the gospel and about how I think we need to seek after Jesus above all other things. And yeah, that doesn't come up with easy answers. I don't know how you should vote in your local senatorial or congressional or presidential election in the US. brothers and sisters in the States, I am totally praying for you in the next couple of days as you make the decisions that you need to make. And I praise God that God is sovereign over all things. So whatever happens, it will be for our best and for His glory. So that would be nice to do. I think, though, what we need to be about is being the kinds of people God calls us to be. That's really easy for me to say, very hard for me to do. Are we able to love our neighbors? Are we able to love our neighbors even when they disagree with us? Are we able to love our neighbors even when they disagree with us vehemently? Are we able to love our ex-Christian atheist neighbor who keeps throwing weird arguments at us? Are we able to love the person who we simply have ignored most of our lives? The person that doesn't agree with us on anything? Are we willing to love the person on TV who keeps saying all sorts of crazy crap that we totally disagree with? Are we able to love them enough to hear them, what they're really saying, and to respond to it, even if we don't agree? And to talk about their ideas as wrong instead of talking about them as wrong? Are we willing to, well, do the hard work of loving our enemies as ourselves? John recommends that I read a book myself online and give a review in real time. Not happening, bro. That would take hours. You don't know how slow I read a book. Anyway, I've actually seemed to have burned up half an hour. Sorry about the fact that this has been mostly a rant. I'm hoping that by God's grace, I will have some real questions. Usually, I'm pretty good to deal with apologetic questions a lot, those kinds of things. But I guess my viewers aren't those kinds of people who have those kinds of questions. But thank you for listening to me while I ranted. I hope by God's grace that you were blessed by it. If you have any questions or concerns about things that I've said, or you want to respond to me, my email address is going to be the same as it always is, steve@considering828.org. If you enjoy this, you can like, share, and subscribe to it. I'm actually here on Facebook, but I also have a YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel has all of these videos every single time I do them. They're easier to find because you don't have to scroll down my entire list to find them. In any case, I'm going to call this off for the rest of the evening. It feels a little short in some ways, but I think I've probably ranted enough for tonight. If you have real questions, I will answer them next week. Again, just to let you know, I'm doing a daily devotional on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday mornings. I will be discussing for the next 5 days a couple of verses that are very famous in Ephesians chapter 2 for the next 5 days on Monday to Friday. So that's starting at 7 a.m. for most mornings, except for the morning I have to be at an elders meeting, at which point it'll probably be about 9:30 before I get the video out. I do the standard thing on Tuesday nights. I will be discussing this week faith alone as the gospel, as the centrality of the Protestant Reformation. And honestly, I think the centrality of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we are saved through faith alone, apart from works of the law. And so if you want to tune in for that, you can talk to me. I think this week I'll probably be ranting a little bit about the fact that faith is not magic. So if you're interested in that, you can join me Tuesday night. Anyway, again, thank you for your time, and I pray that you have a great weekend. I hope you have a great night as well. Good night.